This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, the John C. Whitehead Visiting Fellow in International Diplomacy at the Brookings Institution. Previously, Mr. Feltman served at the State Department as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Mr. Feltman joined us last week on January 16th to discuss the developments in Iran and their broader geopolitical implications. Stay with us as we speak with Jeffrey Feltman. Jeff, thank you so much for joining.
Michael, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to the conversation today.
Jeff, let me just start off very simply. What is the current situation, and have the protesters lost momentum, at least on the streets?
Well, Michael, it's hard to get current, accurate information because of the internet blackout, the communications cutoff that the Iranians imposed on January 8th. But yes, it does seem as though that the protests have crested. It seems as though that for the fifth time since 2009, that the Iranian regime has used brutality, coercion, violence, fear to quiet the streets. But if I'm right, and the regime has survived this, it doesn't mean that the regime is successful. You know, the mullahs, the security thugs that are running the Islamic Republic of Iran really have no easy way to alleviate the economic catastrophe that sparked the protests in the first place. So they're sort of, there's a dilemma there. What are they going to do now, even if the protests have ended through the violence? And the regime also has absolutely no idea what the Trump administration may have in mind beyond the sanctions that were just announced of 18 individuals and entities. You know, in the USS Abraham Lincoln is sailing in the Pacific toward the Gulf. The Israeli Mossad chief, David Barnea, is meeting with President Trump's all-around envoy, Steve Witkoff, in Washington. So the Iranian regime has no idea what's coming from Washington at this point, nor what they'll do in terms of the basic grievances that led to these protests. So the story isn't over. And I like to quote Kareem Sajapur from the Carnegie Endowment, who's one of this country's foremost Iran experts. He said that the crackdown may delay the Islamic Republic's funeral, but it's not going to restore its pulse. He calls it the zombie regime. But it is safe to say this was the most significant demonstration in the Islamic Republic's history. There were demonstrations in all 31 of Iran's provinces, including in conservative clerical cities like Qom and Mashhad. Mashhad is the hometown of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. It was most significant in terms of the broad representation of the country, the sort of the geographic, the social, the ethnic diversity of Iran was all represented. And they started out, in desperation because of the economic conditions of the country. They started out demanding help on the economy, but it quickly evolved into demand for regime change, not simply reform, regime change. So basically, these protests, even if they're over, underscores what is an unbridgeable gap between the regime and the people.
That's fascinating. So let's review for a second. We've all read and heard that, of course, what you said, that these were protests, the most serious of which they've ever seen. But tell us why they were the most broad-based. Is it because they got the conservative, bizarre salesman? Is it because different parts and different classes of people turned out? It wasn't just students. Talk a little bit about why this was unique and why it still might be a coalition that can come back.
I would say all the above that you just mentioned, Michael. But yeah, this was started by the merchants from Tehran's bazaars. And if you remember, for those of us who are old enough to remember 1979, it was when the Shah lost the merchants of the bazaars that the end was nigh for the Shah back in the 70s. And so this starts off as being an economic story. And the economy is far worse than it's been under any other period in the Islamic Republic's 47-year history. Take the currency. The Iranian rial was trading at 42,000 rials to the dollar a year ago, January 2025. That's the official rate. By the end of the year, it was over 1 million rials at the official rate and 1.4 million rials on the black market. How do you deal with that if you are a merchant or even just an average citizen? The inflation rate was over 50%. Food had risen over 70% just in the course of last year. People were desperate. There was at the same time, because of the fiscal constraint, fiscal collapse of the currency, the government cut back the subsidies on the essential commodities like rice and cooking oil. So this was what provoked the initial part of this demonstration on September 28th. But it quickly rage manifested itself. Rage over mismanagement, that were leading to the severe water crises that probably you've heard about in Tehran and elsewhere. Rage over corruption about the regime's elite. The Revolutionary Guards and others in the regime elite basically have become a predatory militarized mafia, that are rapaciously controlling key economic sectors. And protesters were basically saying that it was impossible for the average Iranian to survive, but yet the regime's elite were thriving. This was like an existential issue for the people on the street that the Islamic Republic was doing nothing to address. And then there was also there was a sense of Iranian nationalism. It's worth keeping in mind that that Iran has what they always talk about, the 2,500-year history. It was once an empire. This is not Iran is not a post-colonial construct like Iraq or Jordan, some of the other neighboring countries. Iran has a very strong sense of nationalism. This is not Iranian Islamic Republic nationalism. This is Iranian nationalism. And there was a sense of the protesters of humiliation over the June War, when they saw how weak Iran actually is after all the posturing with its proxies, etc. There was humiliation that of the Israeli penetration that led to the assassination of so many Iranian Revolutionary Guard scientists, etc. It wasn't the protesters were mourning the losses; they were mourning the lack of the government's ability to protect the country. You remember back in 2022 and 2023, there was the Women, Life, and Freedom protest movement that took place after Mahsa Amini, the young woman, was beaten to death for not wearing hijab. She was beaten to death in prison. There was the protest movement then, and there was this protest slogan that evolved that was neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life for Iran. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life for Iran. That came out was used much more frequently in these particular protests, and that's a demonstration of the population's anger against a government that prioritized support to Arab militias over supporting their own population. And there was frustration over the same thing on the nuclear program, prioritizing a nuclear program that did nothing to deter Israel's attack in June over the welfare of the people. So the protesters, I think, saw their living conditions as posing an existential threat to their survival, and the regime was doing nothing about it. But if they saw it as an existential threat, the regime saw it as an existential threat as well. There was a more sophisticated communications blackout this time. It was more sophisticated than during previous demonstrations. Even if the casualty figures are at the low end of what we're hearing, which the low end is about 3,000, that's more than twice the number that were killed under any of the previous protests. And I think most disturbing for those of us who would like to see the end of the Islamic regime was the fact that there was no splintering of the regime itself. You didn't see any hesitation on the part of the Revolutionary Guards or that voluntary paramilitary group, the Basij. There was no hesitation in shooting at unarmed protesters from the information that we have.
Can I ask you that, Jeff? You and others have mentioned that there's certain factors that you need to see to know that the collapse is near. And one, of course, I always hear is defections of military regime officials. Sometimes I hear, related to that, gangs of people with guns that can fight back. On other occasions, it's all of the above, plus they need a real leader. Well, what are we what's missing right now, and what factors might we want to see that would indicate that a collapse is near?
Well, I would use the five criteria that Jack Goldstone, who's a professor at George Mason, who studied revolutions for decades, that he uses. One is fiscal. He has five factors. One, fiscal collapse. Check that box with Iran. Two, compelling opposition narrative. Iran's got that. Check that box. Three is broad-based opposition. Boy, Iran we sure saw that since December 20th. Iran's got that. Number four is sort of conducive or friendly international environment that wouldn't be trying to oppose a change. That's check. You got that. But the fifth is the problem, which is the defection issue you mentioned. It's the splintering of elite. That's the fifth of the five Jack Goldstone criteria. And you don't have a splintering of the elite. And I think this is sort of an example of the it's the Islamic Republic's version of that Ben Franklin quote, whether he said it or not, about that we all need to hang together or we'll most assuredly hang separately. I think it's that the regime recognizes that they have no choice but to stick together, because otherwise they're all going to be hung anyway. But even if the regime has proven again that brutality can quiet the streets, it is not out of the woods. It is in a bind. Regime survival is not regime success. They have no solution to address the underlying grievances that sparked the protest to begin with.
Right.
All those economic conditions. Okay, so they've got they're sitting on lots of oil, but because of sanctions and other things, more than 90% of their oil is sold at steep discounts to China. They're only producing about half as much oil per day, 3.2 billion barrels of oil a day, compared to what was being produced in the 70s under the Shah. They have really no way to increase their revenues at this point in the direct to meet the needs of the population, to try to address the economic grievances. And here's the catch-22 that I see. The only way that they can address these grievances and reverse the catastrophic economic collapse is by reintegrating into the world economy. That's the only solution. But to reintegrate into the world economy will require such fundamental changes in Iran that they would essentially be extinguishing their own regime.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. The Iranian,
they'd have to give up the nuclear program. They'd have to renounce terrorism. Right.
Renounce terrorism. Give up the whole identity, the death to America, death to Israel stuff. And they would have to go after the Revolutionary Guards. They would have to take away the economic privileges that the Revolutionary Guards have amassed for themselves over the past decade or so. I mean, it would change the Islamic Republic beyond anything that resembles it now, which of course would be great. But as you mentioned at the start of this, I think I do have the dubious distinction of being the only former U.S. official who's ever been in a meeting with the supreme leader of Iran. I went to Iran several times when I was at the UN, and one time I was with Ban Ki-moon, then my boss, who we had a small meeting, 2-on-2 meeting with the supreme leader, obviously with an interpreter too, since neither Ban Ki-moon nor I speak Farsi. But it was clear to me what I had read about as a U.S. official studying Iran, which is Khamenei is a true believer. He's a true believer in the death to America, death to Israel. He's a true believer in the revolution, its principles. He's not one to compromise. And in fact, he looks at reform and compromise as a sign of weakness. He talks about the Shah of Iran having lost his reign because he was too soft, because he started at the end of the reign to try to address some of the demands of the protesters. He has blamed Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika, for the collapse of the closed Soviet Union. So he is not going to offer concessions that would lead Iran on the path to reform and the reintegration to the global economy, which is the only solution that they have. Take the hijab law, for example. And, one of the sort of fundamental principles of the Islamic Republic was that women had to wear the hijab. Well, ever since that women life and freedom movement of 2022 and 2023, women have just ignored it in such numbers that the regime has more or less given up trying to enforce it, except for a few performative enforcements here and there. But Khamenei has refused all proposals to take the hijab law off the books. So it's still on the books because he sees anything that would lead to reform as a weakening of the regime, and regime survival is his number one goal. I mean,
yeah.
Well,
let me ask you this. Let's go back a little bit. I mean, you're reassuring, but I'm still alarmed about the protests have waned and there's not a lot out there on the streets. And so let's talk to what U.S. military action might have done or might still be done. If we had hit at the apex of the protests, or maybe when they began to wane, would that have given a big shot in the arm to the protesters, increased their morale? And I hear you, the economy is so bad that the regime is not out of the woods, but if we bomb in a week, and we'll get in a second to who we might bomb, and is that the IRGC or the Besiege or whoever, but is that enough to boost the protesters to get them out and make progress?
I don't know. I mean, it seems as though that it would have been great had we had a way to disrupt the regime's ability, the regime security services' ability to coordinate responses to the demonstrators. I don't think there's anything that we have in our arsenal that could have stood between the protesters and the bullets that they were being fired upon. I think that just wasn't possible. We don't have that kind of presence. But President Trump certainly got the Iranian regime's attention, which I think is extremely useful, and I'm sure he still has their attention. Take, for example, the Iranians offered direct talks on the nuclear program. They have refused direct talks ever since 2018, when President Trump in the first administration pulled out of the Iran deal. So there's a sense of desperation that I'll admit I enjoyed seeing, where the foreign minister is saying, well, now we'll have direct talks. Surely that was kind of a Hail Mary in hoping to stave off military attacks, even though the indirect talks back in June did not stave off the military attacks. And the fact that the announced planned execution of the first demonstrator to be executed, a guy named Irfan Sultani, a 26-year-old, was then hastily dropped, and all these statements put out about, well, we're not really going to execute demonstrators, was also, I think, an example of the Iranian regime paying attention to what President Trump might do. Now, I don't know what his options are. I don't think a Maduro type operation, even if it's possible, and perhaps it's possible, it's a pretty impressive operation in Caracas. I don't think it will transform the country because there are too many people in the IRGC and the elite that would quickly fill the gap in the same way that Khamenei's departure would lead.
All right. Well, let me pressure you. I agree. There's no way to get in the middle of the protesters, and I like your point about trying to prevent the regime from coordinating among themselves. But let's assume that we said, all right, we don't know if this will be completely determinative, but we're expressing our support for you. And let's say we hit significant posts of the Besiege, the IRGC, maybe even some police stations, maybe intelligence facilities. I've heard and read for years that air campaigns alone don't make a regime change. But do you think that would work? Do you think that would just increase the morale so much that people would really go out and maybe start taking government buildings?
I don't know, Michael. Or would they react and say, we're Iranians, we have 2,500 years, who are these people attacking us? I don't know. But I think that if that happens, the Iranian regime would definitely see it as an existential threat, as they should.
They already do, though, right? They're already massacring everyone.
That's right. They already do. So what we would have to be prepared for is an all-out assault from their remaining ballistic missile and launcher sites, so that we always just need to be prepared for that. My preference would be go after the communications within the regime. the Israelis clearly have penetrated the system to an almost unimaginable degree. Continue the assassinations that the Israelis have proven so good at. Go after the ghost ships that are taking that oil to China. Now, cutting off Iranian revenue will, of course, also hurt the population even more than they're already hurting. But I think that there's ways that you can go after the economic underpinnings of the regime and after their communications in ways that might not lead to the same type of retaliation that the direct military strikes would do.
Okay. So let's talk about Israel. First, the 12-day war, there were dozens of accounts that came out that said Netanyahu wanted to target the supreme leader, and the United States talked him out of it. Does that mean, and I'm sure they're better, I think they're better on OPSEC now than they were in June, but do you think Israel or the United States would target the supreme leader? And I have to just go ahead and also ask at this point, because it's relevant, David Sanger in the New York Times reports that Israel, maybe because there aren't two carrier strike groups in the region to help shoot down missiles, but it says Israel was uncomfortable with the United States going, let's call it this week or last week. They want these carriers to be back. They're not saying don't do it. They're just saying not now. Do you credit that? And do you think, and would Israel get involved? Do you think that they want to go ahead and pull the trigger on a decapitation strike of the supreme leader? That's a bunch of stuff. See if you can unpack it.
Well, in Israel, I think it is quite interesting to see the distinction between December 29th, when Prime Minister Netanyahu met with President Trump in Mar-a-Lago, and the David Sanger New York Times article that you mentioned that says that the Israelis have said, hey, wait, not now, in terms of trying to strike Iran. Because I think back in December, Netanyahu was trying to warm Trump up for further attacks on the remnants of Iran's nuclear program. And then if David Sanger is to be believed, and he's a credible journalist, now they're saying not now. My reading of that is that because the Israelis, as I said, have so deeply penetrated the Iranian system in terms of intelligence and both signals and human intelligence, that they must have an idea of what the Iranians would do in retaliation. And they're not, and the Israelis do not want that retaliation right now, is my conclusion.
Just as long as I'm throwing hypotheticals at you, if, let's say, the United States is bombing in a week, does Israel get involved in the bombing as well? Or is that the bridge too far that might backfire? And the Iranians say it's one thing to get support from the United States. It's quite another to get it from the Zionist regime. So let's say they don't. Is it more likely they participate or don't?
I think it's more likely they'll participate in some way, and we're going to be accused of doing Israel's business by the regime anyway. So I can overanalyze this and say, oh yes, the Israelis should stay out because that makes it too easy for the Iranian regime to blame the Zionists. But they're going to blame us anyway. They're going to say that we're working in cahoots with the Israelis anyway. You know, they accused the protesters of being agents of the Zionists and the Americans, and the protesters clearly weren't agents of the Zionists, the Israelis and the Americans. So I'm less worried about that. In fact, the fact that Israel does have such good intelligence on Iran, I would hope that they would be involved in some way if there's any kind of kinetic action. And I think that, yes, I'm sure we have the capacity to take out the supreme leader. I just don't know what difference that is going to make, except the one that you point out, which is psychological on the protesters. Would that reignite mass demonstrations against the regime, because they would have an enormous morale boost if the supreme leader would suddenly disappear.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Jeffrey Feltman.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Let's talk about other regional positions. First, the articles this week have said that some of the Gulf states don't want regime change in Iran because they're opposed to any populist movement that forces political change. That's just not, let's call it what the Saudis or the UAE or anyone want. And Iran's weak after the 10-12-day war, and that's a good place for them to be. First of all, or are they just saying that for their own populations and they, like everything else, would love it if Iran collapsed? So what's true of the so-called Gulf Arabs in this conflict?
Well, I mean, you and I are both generalizing here because there's obviously distinctions between them, with better relations of some Gulf countries with Iran than others. But in general, I think that there are four elements that the Gulf leaders would be looking at. One is the one you mentioned, which is, we don't really like the idea of popular revolts overthrowing regimes, even if we don't like the regimes. We didn't like it when it happened in Egypt and Tunisia. We don't like that example. So that is part of the story. Part of it is the idea of chaos and war next door. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, has his Vision 2030, where he wants to bring in investors and capital and tourists. Is anyone going to come if there's chaos and war next door in Iran, if there's outflows of refugees, et cetera? So part of it is the idea of stability in order to meet the economic diversification plans of Saudi Arabia and others. Part of it is they kind of like Iran being weak,
as
it is. And then there's the Israeli factor. I would put the UAE in a different category when I talk about Israel, because Israel and the UAE continue to work quite closely together in a number of geographic areas and thematic issues. But ever since the September 8th Israeli attack on the Hamas building in Doha, Qatar, so a U.S. ally, Israel, attacking Doha, that most of the Gulf countries have seen a reckless Israel as being a bigger threat to the region than a weak Iran. And that's significant. That's a significant change. So September 8th and combined with the revelation in the June war, how weak Iran actually is, has given the rest of the region some pause about Israel, meaning that having some kind of counterweight, weak as it is, isn't so bad. So I would say that those are the four elements that the Gulf Arabs are looking at. It's worth noting that they've been very quiet about what's happening in Iran. We've seen the reports of Gulf Arabs approaching the Trump administration to say, "Hey, don't use a military attack." They're clearly afraid of retaliation. They saw it in June, but publicly, with the exception of Oman, I'm not aware of any public statement from any of the Gulf countries.
Yeah,
okay. I think they realize that that the regime is going to survive. They're going to have to deal with an even weaker Iran next door, and they're not going to say anything to make that relationship more complicated. As you know, from 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran had developed a sort of rapprochement, where they're sort of live and let live with each other in the region.
Jeff, let's talk a little bit about the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi. Talk a little bit about him. He is seemingly charismatic. There are reports that the protesters on the streets have at least mentioned his name or shouted his name a few times. Is he going to be somebody that the regime he could take over for the regime? Is it a serious possibility, or is it just because there's no one else that has name identification?
Yeah, it's more the latter, Michael. But it certainly is true that his name was used, chanted a lot more in this demonstration than in the last one, the 2022, 2023 demonstrations. His name came up, but nothing like it came up this time. It's, again, because of this internet blackout. It's still not. I can't say for sure how often or how much of the protesters were chanting his name, but it is worth remembering that something like 2/3 of the population of Iran was born after the Shah had fallen, and so if you're a younger Iranian, I guess 79's not even that young, and you look at the pictures of Iran from the Shah's time, you're not looking at pictures of the repression. You're looking at social freedoms. You're looking at a country that was where the income levels were on the increase. You can see why there'd be a certain romance looking at that history compared to what they're going through now. So I think that he's important as a symbol of what the Iranians, but the repression that the Shah also had, that they want to leave behind. I find it interesting that the White House is being very careful on the question of Reza Pahlavi without, they're not promoting him any more than they were promoting, Maria Corina Machado for Venezuela. So the White House certainly still has not seen him as the answer.
Yeah, I've taken that, especially in Venezuela, but also here as an implicit criticism of the Bush administration's reliance on de-Baathification and a complete chopping off of the military officers and top bureaucrats in Iraq, because that led to pandemonium and helter-skelter, and it's obvious that they would rather not deal with that kind of strife at the outset. Let's talk a little bit about domestic politics. I know you're a national security foreign policy expert and can speak about things all over the world, but part of this, undeniably, I think, for President Trump is American credibility. He's the president that follows through on what he says and mocked President Obama for not enforcing the red line in Syria when Syria used chemical weapons. And of course, President Obama seems a little bit embarrassed that he didn't speak out on behalf of the Green Movement in 2009, because he said repeatedly, I got bad advice from staff. I thought it might backfire. I didn't do it. I regret it. I should have been more positive. But what do you think the domestic political angle here is, and how does that impact our decision making?
Well, I think that the Obama example is a very good one. I was Assistant Secretary of State at the time, so I'm culpable in this, in part of this, which is that we sort of collectively thought, let's not make this about us. This is about the Iranians. So let's publicly be bystanders. And I think that was, I agree with President Obama, that was a mistake. Now, we did do things to help on the communications. It was more rudimentary than, there's nothing like Starlink at the time, but we did work hard to find ways to try to keep communications open, to support the protesters. But in terms of our public position, it was very much being a bystander. And I think that President Trump is not a bystander, and that no one expects President Trump to be a bystander. And it's one of the reasons why I think that I said at the beginning, the story's not over, because I think that there will be some kind of U.S. reaction to what's happening in Iran that goes beyond the 18 sanctions that were announced recently. That's not going to be sufficient to scratch that itch, either in the White House or with those people who are the constituency for trying to get regime change in Iran. Now, at the same time, you mentioned the de-Baathification efforts in Iraq, which led to such chaos, and of course led to eventually the rise of Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, the Sunni backlash. We have a bigger problem in Iran than we had in Iraq, in terms of the regime. If there's a change in Iran, if this regime collapses, what do you do with 150,000 Revolutionary Guard forces? What do you do with the besieged, the paramilitary volunteers, who are true believers? These are not. The trouble we had in Iraq was we said, okay, anyone who was ever a Ba'athist, and people had to be Ba'athists because that was the only way they could keep their job as a school teacher or a doctor. A lot of people who lost their job because of bad U.S. policy that condemned everybody. But in Iran, the people with power are true believers. These are not people who just said, "Oh well, we'll be an IRGC, we'll be a Revolutionary Guard because that's how we can advance in our company." No, these are thugs who have fired on protesters. And so, how do you replace that level of control? I'm not sure we have the answer. And President Trump certainly is not going to want to get into a place where we are suddenly responsible for a country of 92 million people, that the economy is in free fall. And I think that the American public, as happy as we'd all be to see the Islamic Republic disappear, we aren't going to be very patient if we are left in the sort of Colin Powell Pottery Barn scenario that we broke it, we own it.
I could also see us not releasing sanctions immediately if the IRGC is still a force. All right, well, let's talk about things that the United States could do short of military action. You mentioned in the Obama administration, you should mention I think it was Google and how they may have been helpful. And you also mentioned earlier on this call that there's an opportunity for maybe trying to prevent the regime from coordinating so closely in their repressive activities, should everybody go back out on the streets. But everyone's talking about Starlink and the digital blackout. Many reports say the Chinese are jamming Starlink. What's in the category of things that could help the protesters coordinate among themselves or prevent the regime from repressing the protesters? What else is in all these other categories short of the use of force?
Well, I would say communications are key. How do you promote communications among the opposition and between the opposition and the outside world? So that's key. How do you provide alternative sources other than Islamic Republic news to the Iranian public? Keep the momentum up that way. Here I am, a former diplomat, saying I think the assassinations are useful. That if some of these IRGC leaders start seeing their colleagues being bumped off, and the bumping off is linked to protest repression rather than just the nuclear program that happened in June, maybe you'll start seeing an erosion of that solidarity that I think is the glue that still holds the Islamic Republic together. I think it's time for us to be much harder with our allies, assuming they're still allies, Greenland, etc., on their relations with Iran. There's been the Europeans in particular have, they'll do the statement equivalent of a hand slap, but it's time to really break off the relationships. This is not a normal country or a normal regime, and a country of 92 million people with this sort of hydrocarbon wealth should be in the G20. It's not. It's on the threshold of being a failed state, and the Europeans and others will still pretend that it's more or less a normal country that has an unfortunate human rights situation. Let's really build some solidarity with other countries again, to wake up to the reality of what this country really is.
Okay, so let's talk about some other ethnic groups inside of Iran. I think that the Israeli intelligence success, the covert action success of assassinations, being able to steal documents, all the things that they've been able to do inside the country are probably recruited from ethnic groups that have ancient beefs with the regime. Where are they in all of this? It doesn't seem like they are trying to exploit the opportunity that's been going on over the last 2 weeks. And I may have even seen a statement from one, I don't know if it was the Kurds or another, that said, we can't wait for this to happen, but it's not going to happen now. What role are all these other groups going to play in this, and why didn't they seize the opportunity recently?
As I understand, and again, once again, the communications blackout has made getting accurate information hard. As I understand it, that these protests did have sort of a cross-ethnic dimension to them, that you had Kurds, definitely had Azeris, as well as Persians who were out in these protests. So the protest movements did reflect the diversity of Iran, at least to some extent. And you've also got that sense of Iranian nationalism that the Azeris in Iran, they're not as numerous as the Persians, but they feel Iranian. They don't feel they don't have a loyalty to Azerbaijan, even if they're linguistically or ethnically linked to Azerbaijan. It's this. In fact, Khamenei himself, the supreme leader, is of Azeri background. So that there's more cohesion than you might see in other places that are so multi-ethnic. That's not to say that everyone's happy. That's not to say that there hasn't been suppression of the Arab minority on the peripheries or the Kurds along the Iraqi border. But I at least as I understand Iran, I would be less concerned that I've seen some analysis that if the regime would collapse, you'd have a splintering of Iran in the same way that you see splinterings of other countries. I think that there's more cohesion there because there's more of a sense of being Iranian because of that long history.
Yeah. And maybe the gangs with guns, they're on the ground. They probably understand the regime better than we do. Maybe they just didn't think that timing was propitious for this. But it feels like they're going to play some sort of role down the road. All right. Here's another factor that it may come into play any week now. The supreme leader is almost 90, I think.
Yeah, 86.
86. And even before this, of course, there's the occasional article about the dilemma of succession in Iran, no obvious candidate. What happens short of this whole this disaster for them of legitimacy and economic collapse? It was going to be difficult anyway. Walk us all through this. Who selects the supreme leader? Are there dark horse candidates? Are there favorites? Or is this just like a papal conclave and we're not going to know until we know?
The favorite candidate that would have been probably selected when Khamenei dies would have been Ibrahim Raisi, the last president of Iran. He was the front runner, but he was killed in a helicopter accident, I think 2 years ago, where the Iranians can't even protect their own president. So that put the succession into question. People talk about Mujtaba Khamenei, who is the son of the current supreme leader. But when Khamenei, the original, the first Ayatollah, the first supreme leader, came to power, he said that hereditary rule was not Islamic. So there's a little problem there with Mujtaba, that given Khamenei's diktat about no hereditary rule. So I don't think that we can predict who the supreme leader is going to be, but I think we can say that the assembly that comes together of clerics to elect the new supreme leader will be heavily influenced by the IRGC. That the IRGC has become a much, much stronger political player than it was, say, 15 years ago. And so you're going to have a military clerical understanding about who the next supreme leader would be, and it would be somebody who would let the IRGC maintain its privileges and its controls over large segments of the economy. One of the things that struck me when I was in that meeting with Khamenei that I mentioned was just how uncharismatic he is. He doesn't have the sort of presence that you would expect of the supreme leader. I was ambassador to Lebanon, and I used to watch the speeches of Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, to try to glean whatever information we could about what Hezbollah had up its sleeves. Nasrallah was very good about previewing, if you understood what to look for, what Hezbollah was about to do. And Nasrallah had real charisma. He really could. He was entertaining. He kept audience attention, rapt attention. And so I kind of expected Khamenei to be along those lines. He's not. He's very unimpressive speaker, wooden, no charisma. So I don't think. I think that he's there because of inertia in the system. I don't think he's there because people, even the IRGC, find him particularly impressive. It's because they find him useful.
So you said earlier that of all the factors that influence whether a regime like this would collapse, one would be elite fracture, and that doesn't obtain at the moment. But I think what this question is about is what would signal elite fracture? Would it be IRGC factions breaking off, maybe besieged factions going their own way, or we used to ask the intelligence community of this. Well, what should we look for to know that something's about to happen?
People's children being sent out of the country.
Okay.
People's children finding other ways. And there was a rumor. The foreign minister Abbas Arachi was in Beirut beginning of last week, and there was a rumor that he was there with his family. And this caused all sorts of stir among Iran watchers. Was he the first civilian defection? Well, no, he was there on an official visit, but where his baggage, by the way, was sent back to the plane because the Lebanese said it did not contain diplomatic content. Interesting. So anyway, so I would say civilian defections of high rank and children out of the country will probably take place before you see IRGC splitting. And then there's the question of, at some point, will people in the IRGC and the besieged not fire on unarmed protesters? We haven't seen that yet either.
By the way, just on the IRGC, I mean, I never hear much about factions or IRGC people who want to reform, but are they a monolith or not?
It seems to be pretty much a monolith. The Israelis assassinated the IRGC commander in June during the June War, and the structures were such that didn't cause any kind of real break, and there's not been the sort of singular figure that Soleimani was before President Trump had his assassinated in January 2020, I think, has emerged. So there seems to be enough of a bench and enough of a structure, enough cohesion that you didn't start seeing fissures within the IRGC, even when their leader was killed in June.
Okay, let's talk a little bit as we begin to wrap up about if the regime collapsed, and I'm sure there would be a huge tumultuous year or so, but some are already saying this would be a new Middle East. It would be a glorious Middle East. It would finally be unburdened by the sins of the past and could grow, and all sorts of new and wonderful things could happen. Do you think this would beckon such a new flowering across the Middle East?
Well, I think Iran has incredible potential.
But what about across the whole region? Like, would it have this salutary effect?
I think that yes, I think it would have a salutary effect. I mean, we would not be seeing attempts to rebuild proxy networks, things like that. So yes, I think it would have a salutary effect across the region over the long term, even if there's some chaos in the short term. And the Iranian, you often hear people talk about Iran as isolated as North Korea. I've been to North Korea too, as part of my UN duties. And there's a huge difference, not only in just the size of the population, with Iran of 19 million people, it's that these Iranian people, despite everything, have maintained international ties. They have a sophisticated understanding of the international landscape. They're merchants. They're educated, whereas the North Koreans are really completely cut off from the world. And so I think that you would find the Iranian society would quickly adjust to being back as part of the normal world where they believe that they deserve to be all along.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Last question. Let's look to the future. We have at least one carrier strike group steaming towards the Mediterranean. And of course, we're going to look for U.S. military action, even maybe short of the carrier arriving, depending on whether the president's trying to give a feint here. We're going to look towards economic factors, or any other banks going to collapse. And the Wall Street Journal and has mentioned that. Scott Bessent's talked a little bit about the way the money is moving and how that might indicate the regime members fleeing if they're putting their U.S. dollars abroad or their own money in places that they could access it, maybe in Europe. What do you see? What are we going to look at in the future in the next week to month?
There will be more U.S. action than just simply the sanctions that we put in place. I'm convinced of that. President Trump is not going to stop with 18 sanctions. I don't think that what we do will bring down the regime. I think that it will further weaken the regime, which in itself should embolden the population. But I don't know when the protesters are going to come back out on the street in such numbers to really mark the fact that we are now at the end, that we've now reached the point of the funeral that Kareem Sajapar talked about. But I think that what we're going to see is a continuing weakening of the regime. It's already lost its, whatever legitimacy it had in terms of the popularity. And at some point, it's going to collapse of its own contradictions.
Yeah, that's the other big picture that I've heard a lot of commentators say recently, which is if they don't, collapse is now assured. It may not be in this month, but it's coming, and even some say this year.
Yeah, I would say you're either going to have the regime will continue to weaken until it collapses, or the regime will improbably try to take the decisions that we talked about earlier to reintegrate in the world economy, which in and of itself would end the Islamic regime.
Jeff, thank you so much for doing this. Those of us over here at Beacon are going to be tracking every part of this, and let us know if you have any additional follow-up questions. But Jeff, we hope to have you back really soon because this story's not going away.
Look forward to keeping in touch, Michael. Thank you very much for having me. It's an important topic.
That was Jeffrey Feltman. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoyed listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.